What's up everybody, welcome back to the next part in my Unreal Engine 4 mini-series about setting up basic AI. So in the previous video we added the ability for our enemy to take damage and die, and now we are going to add the ability to spawn in enemies in your level, otherwise it's going to be a pretty boring game. So we're going to create spawners. I added a new folder in here called levels, and that's all I changed. So this is the same project as we ended up the last time. I'm going to create a new blueprint in here, and I'm going to create an actor. This is going to be a spawn point blueprint, so I'm going to name it spawn point. And it's going to be really simple. Let's open this up. I'm going to add one billboard. So add component and search for the billboard. And that's pretty much all that's going to be in here. This is just to visualize the spawners in the map so we can see them in the editor. So make sure it's hidden in game. If you don't select the billboard, you need to enable this, and billboards are hidden in game by default, so that's fine. Now we do need to add one variable in here, and that's going to be our spawn point ID. Spawn point ID. And that's going to be a string. And that's all. So compile and save this, and we're done in here. Now create a new blueprint. Again, this is going to be an actor, and this is going to be the actual spawner. So I'm going to call this enemy spawner. And let's open this up. We're going to do the same thing in the viewport, so we're going to add a billboard again so we can see where the spawners are at in the editor. Now for this one I'm going to select a different, right, so you can see the difference between a spawn point and a spawner. Let's scale this down a little bit, so that should work. Now let's add some code in here. First let's get rid of these two, we're not going to use them. Just keep your event begin play, and that's fine. First we're going to add a few variables in here. So click the little plus sign and create a boolean that's called start active. Start active. It's a boolean, so that's fine. The next variable we need is activation ID. This is going to be a string, so change it into a string. Next we need the spawn location. This is going to be a transform, so not a vector but a transform. The next variable is the count. This is going to be an integer. Next we need the spawn delay minimum. Turn this one into a float, and I'm going to duplicate it and create spawn delay maximum. That's also a float, so that's fine. Next we need the use spawn points variable. This one is going to be a boolean. Next we need the spawn points ID. This is a string. And the last variable we need is spawn points. And this is going to be an array of actor object references. So search for actor. Over here you want to select the object reference and then turn this into an array by clicking the little symbol and turn it into an array. So that should work like this. Now for the spawn delay minimum, I'm going to set a default value of 1 and for the maximum of 1.5. So if we do not enter anything in there, at least we have something to work with. And we need to make some of these variables public so we can edit them in the details panel. We are going to do that for pretty much all of them except the spawn location and the spawn points array. So click the little closed eye symbol in here and it's going to turn into an opened eye. And you want to do this for all of them except for these two. Compile and save this. Now we do need to go back to our spawn point blueprint And you also want to make this spawn point ID public, so also click the little eye symbol over here and go back to the spawner. Now let's add the first code in here. Let's create a new custom event, and this is going to be start spawning. The first thing we are going to add in here is a delay. If you hold D and click, you get a delay. That's a little keyboard shortcut. Drag off here and look for random float in range. And in this node we are simply going to plug in the spawn delay minimum and the spawn delay maximum. So it's going to wait for a random time in between these two values, in between spawning. The next thing we need to add in here is a branch. So hold B and click to create a branch, and we want to check if we are using spawn points or not. So drag in the use spawn points boolean. For this one, from the true pin we want to continue and add another branch. So connect the next branch up to the true pin. And for this branch we want to check the size of our spawn points array. So drag in your spawn points while holding Ctrl, drag off here and look for length. And we want to know if our array is equal to 1. So if we only have one spawn point, we do not want to randomize anything, so we are just going to pick the one we have. And if we have multiple spawn points, we are going to pick a random one. So we're going to check if we need to do that or not. Now next, let's continue from the false pin over here first. So we are going to set our spawn location. Drag in the spawn location, hold Alt to get a setter. Connect it up to the false pin, and for this one it's going to be really simple. We just want to get our actor transform. So right click, get actor transform, and we want to get it off ourselves, so that's fine. If we are not using separate spawn points, we are going to spawn the AI at the position of the spawner, so that's why we are using ourselves here. So we're done with this branch. Now go back to the previous branch and we are going to continue from the true pin first. Again, we are going to set the spawn location. So we can copy these two nodes. Connect these up to the true pin over here. And in this case, we want to get the spawn location, or sorry, the actor transform of the first spawn point in the array. So we are going to copy the getter for the array, drag off here, type get a copy, and we're going to get the thing that's in index 0, because there's only one index in the array, and an array always starts at index 0, so that's the only thing in there. So that's fine. And for the last one, we are going to do kind of the same thing again. So copy these two nodes, connect them up to the false pin, but now we are going to get a random item from one of the arrays. So we can also copy this, plug it into here, drag off here and look for random float in range, sorry, random integer in range this time. I'm typing float, but so random integer in range. Now for the starting index you want to keep it at 0, because that's where the array begins, and for the end we are going to copy the spawn points array, the length, and subtract 1 from this, so -1, and that's going to be the maximum index we can use. So if we have an array with 2 items, it's going to have index 0 and 1. So we cannot go higher than 1, that's why we need to subtract 1 from this. So we got that set up, and we have our spawn location set. So now we're going to spawn the enemy, drag off here and look for the spawn actor, or sorry, spawn actor from class. And we are going to connect all 3 of these to this node. You want to spawn your enemy, so I'm going to select my enemy blueprint. And for the spawn transform, I'm going to change it a little bit, so I'm going to drag it in here and I'm going to right click and hit the split struct pin. So this is going to split the transform into the location, rotation and scale. I want to get the rotation and add a little bit to the Z axis, so we can simply drop the spawners on the floor in the editor and we don't have to worry about the thing colliding with the floor itself. So I'm just gonna move it up 3 units. Now drag off here again and type make transform. So we can combine these values again into a new transform. Just connect up the rotation and I'm going to leave the scale at 0 so we cannot accidentally change the scale in the transform and mess things up. It's always going to be 1. Did I say 0? Leave it at 1. I'm sorry. So that should work like this. Now after this we want to add a branch and we want to check if our count is equal to -1, so equal to integer, and in here we're going to say -1. Connect this up to the condition. So how we are going to use this, if we set the count for a spawner to -1, it's going to spawn endlessly. If we set an actual number in here, it's going to spawn that amount of AI, and after that it's going to stop spawning. So we have 2 options in here. So if it's -1, we're going to loop back to the beginning in a little bit. If it's not -1, we're going to subtract 1 from our count. So drag in a setter and drag in a getter as well. From the getter drag off and do -1 and set the count to that, because we just spawned 1 enemy. And we're going to check again. And this time we want to know if our count is still higher than 0. So drag in the count greater than integer and make sure it's greater than 0. Connect it up to the condition. Now if it's not greater than 0 and it's also not -1, it's at 0, so we gotta stop spawning. We're going to break the loop and we're going to destroy the actor. So I'm just gonna add a little delay in here. Let's make it half a second, and after that I'm going to say destroy actor. And I'm going to destroy myself, so we get rid of the spawner if we don't need it anymore. Now for the true pin, I'm going to drag it all the way back to the delay node over here. Let's clean this up a little bit. Just like this. And for the second branch, we also want to connect the true pin to the loop, so it's going to loop back to the beginning as well. So that's our spawn function, and that should work. Now we're going to create a second custom event. So right click and custom event. This is going to be called activate spawner. And all this does is call the start spawning event. So drag off and type start spawning. And that should be good. Now for the next thing, we are going to go to our begin play event. I'm scrolling down in my notes in the meantime. Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to add a sequence here, drag off and look for the sequence. I really like these notes, it keeps things nice and organized, so that's why I use them. For the first thing, I'm going to drag off here and add a branch. We want to know if we are using spawn points, so drag in the use spawn points. If we are going to make sure we collect the right spawn points. So we're going to get all actors of class, drag it off from the true pin, get all actors of class. We want to get all of our spawners, so look for enemy spawner blueprint. And now we are going to add a for each loop. So if you hold F and press, you get a for each loop. Connect it up and connect the out actors to the array. So for every index in the array, we want to check if the activation ID or the spawn point ID, I'm sorry, is equal to the spawn point ID we entered here. So drag of the array element, type get spawn point ID. Oh, we don't want to get the enemy spawners in here, we want to get the spawn points, I'm sorry. So look for spawn point blueprint in the get all actors of class. Now if we drag off here and look for get spawn point ID, so this one didn't update, it still says enemy spawner in here, so I'm going to delete the for each noob and get a new one. So now if we drag off here, did it say spawn point enemy spawner? I'm getting confused, but in this case we should be able to get the spawn point ID just like this, and we want to check if this is equal to the spawn point ID we entered for this spawner. So connect this up to the condition, connect this one up to the loop body, and if it's true, we are going to add this index or this element to our spawn point array. So drag in your spawn point array, drag off here and type add unique. Connect this one to the true pin, and we want to add this array element to our spawn point array. So connect that one up. Make sure you don't forget. And that should be good to go. Now there's one thing we want to do for the next sequence node, and that's add another branch in here. Connect this up, and we want to check if we start active. And if we start active, we are going to call the start spawning function immediately. Just like this. So this should work for our spawner. I'm going to compile and save this. Now there's one little thing I want to add in the level blueprint. So if you go to blueprints over here and open your level blueprint, right click and add a custom event, and call this one, let's call it activate spawner. Activate spawner. It's going to have one input, so add the little plus sign over here, add an input, and call this activation ID. Activation ID, and this is a string. Now for this function we want to get all actors of class again, so drag off, get all actors of class. Now in this case we do want to get all spawners, so search for your spawners, enemy spawner. We want to get a for each loop with break this time, so drag off the array, and if you type break you get a for each loop with break. Connect this up. And for the loop body we want to add a branch, and we want to check if the array element activation ID, so get activation ID, if that's the same as the one we put in the inputs, so look for equal and connect it up to the input activation ID. So if these match, this is one of the spawners we want to activate, so we are going to break the loop, go from the true pin and connect it to the break. So that means the loop won't continue looping through the array, it's going to stop because we know what we need to know. There's no need to continue looking through all the indexes. So from here we're going to drag off the array element and enter start spawning, and simply go connect that to the completed pin, just like this. So we have a little function to activate separate spawners. Let's compile and save this as well. Now we should be good to go. Let me give you a few examples of how you can use this. So I've changed the map a little bit and added a few areas. It's the same map, but it's just a little bit bigger. So there's a few things you can do with this spawner. I'm going to drag one in. the enemy spawner. It doesn't really matter where it is. So if you have this selected in your viewport, if you go to the details panel over here, you can enter all the variables you need. So for the first one we placed here, I'm going to make sure it starts active. So it's activated right whenever the game starts or the level starts. So if it starts active, it doesn't need an activation ID, that's fine. So for the count, we can enter how much enemies we want to spawn. If we enter -1, it's going to keep spawning endlessly. And otherwise we can enter a number in here. So I'm just going to spawn 2 enemies in here. The spawn delay, that's fine by me. So in between 1 and 1.5 seconds. And I can choose to use spawn points in here. If I'm not using spawn points, the enemies will simply spawn at the location of the spawner. If I place spawn points in my map, I can enable this boolean, give them the ID string, and then the enemies will randomly spawn on those spawn points. So the first example in here is going to be basic. It's going to start active, spawn 2 enemies at this location. Now let's go to the next room. I'm going to drag in a second spawner. And I'm also going to drag in spawn points. So I'm going to place one in this corner. Now before I'm going to copy it, I'm going to give it an activation ID or a spawn point ID. Let's call this spawn point array number 1. Let's duplicate this. So we have 3 spawn points in here. And it will randomly spawn an enemy at one of these points. And it's not going to spawn anything at the spawner. So we're going to set this up. It's not going to start active this time. So we need an activation ID. Let's call it spawner number 1. Let's spawn 4 enemies. The spawn delay is fine with me. We're going to use spawn points and we need to enter the ID we want to link it to. So we entered spawn point array number 1 in here. And we are also going to add that to the spawn point ID on the spawner. So now these are linked together. Now there's one thing we need to do to activate this spawner, and you can do this for example with a trigger. So I'm going to look for a box trigger and I'm going to drag that into the corridor over here so we can't miss it. Let's extend it a little bit so we definitely can't miss it. There we go. Now if you keep this trigger selected and you go back to your level blueprint, if you right click, you get a few options to use for the entity you have selected. So we're going to expand the add event for trigger. We're going to add a collision event on actor begin overlap. So select this one. And as you can see, it's doing it for the trigger box we just placed. Now all we need to do here is drag off the other actor and cast it to the player. So cast to third person character. If the cast succeeds, it means the player walked to the trigger and we are going to activate the spawner that belongs to this trigger box. So we are simply going to say activate spawner. Activate spawner, there it is. And all we need to do in here is enter the ID for the spawner we want to activate, and that's spawner number 1 because that's what we entered in the activation ID. So if we select it here, activation ID spawner 1, we want to add that over here to the activate spawner event. So now if we walk to this trigger, it's going to activate the spawner and it's going to start spawning. Or at least that's the ID behind it. So that's the second use of a trigger like this. And now we can simply say, let's add a third trigger in the last area. And let's set the count to -1 so it keeps spawning forever. Let's do we want to activate it? That's not really useful, so do not activate it. We need an activation ID again, so spawner number 2. We're not going to use spawn points, so they're all going to spawn over here. The spawn delay, that's fine by me. So all we need to add now in the level blueprint is another function to activate it. So let's add another trigger box in here. Let's resize it a little bit. Keep it selected and go back to your level blueprint. So that's this one. And again, right click, add event for trigger box 2, add a collision event on actor begin overlap. We can copy this stuff, connect the other actor to the object, connect the execution, and this time we want to activate spawner number 2. So this should work. Compile and save this, close it down. Let's compile and save this as well. So in the first area here we have a spawner that's going to spawn enemies at the spawner location. It's going to spawn 2 enemies. In the next one it's going to use the spawn points and it's going to use random locations, and in the last one it's going to spawn indefinitely and also spawn at the spawner location. So let's see if this works. So we have the 2 enemies spawned in and we had one already placed in the map, so that's working. Let me kill these guys quickly. Now nothing is happening in here. That's fine until I walk through this corridor, and then they should start spawning. So there we have the first one. There we have 2 more. Could be 1 more, I think. So it missed one, and I can explain why that happens in a little bit. Let's go to the next room. So when I walk through the corridor again, it's activating the spawner and it starts spawning. So these enemies all spawn at the spawner location instead of separate spawn points, and this will just keep going forever and ever. So we have created one blueprint spawner and we have different ways of using it. So it's a pretty versatile setup, I guess. Now the reason why it probably didn't spawn that one enemy, because we set it to count 4 and we only got 3 enemies, is because of the collision probably. So if an enemy is already walking in the position where the new enemy is going to spawn, they're going to collide and it's not going to spawn. You can change it to always spawn and ignore collision, but you will take the risk they get stuck in each other or in floors or walls and stuff like that. So something to keep in mind. Well, I think that should do it for this video. I hope most of this stuff makes sense and it helps you out. Thanks for watching everybody, and I'll talk to you later. Bye bye.